The fact that religious leaders had greater access to exotic materials is very apparent in this region, as it is in many other areas of the Southwest. And we see this in the density of exotic materials that appear in burials that also have artifacts like prayer sticks and altar paraphernalia. And we also see it in the fact that apparent trade hubs also had notable public architecture. So in this area, during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, new types of trade goods began to appear. The two that I've been specifically working with a lot are parrots and conch shells. And when I say conch, that's code for Strombus and Murex species. This happened at the same time as an apparent shift in ritual practice, which we see in the construction of new types of public ritual architecture. And some of this architecture, particularly in the Wupatki area, that's awful. Particularly in the Wupatki area, seem to incorporate elements that are local spins on architecture that appeared earlier in the Chaco interaction sphere. And I thought that the shift in trade networks might be directly related to the introduction of new types of ceremonies from the Chaco sphere, and I'm certainly not the first person to suggest that. Some other people at this conference put forth the idea first. But Chaco centers from the 10th century onwards have, it's one of the few areas where you actually see those two particular types of exotic trade goods, parrots and conch shells, and they appear in quantities in some Chaco break houses. My view of the connection between ceremony and prestige trade is kind of unabashedly informed by direct historic analogy. In the Western Pueblos, the households that direct important ceremonies and curate that particular ceremony's ritual paraphernalia have a series of associated rights and responsibilities. And often one of these rights is the right to collect and distribute particular exotic trade goods that also have meaning and ritual importance. And I wondered if in the Flagstaff area, the introduction of ceremonies that originated in Chaco could have brought with them associated systems of exotic resource procurement. However, actually, identifying this sort of pattern in a prehistoric system requires not only identifying who controls particular trade networks, but also identifying who controls very particular ceremonies in the archaeological record. And obviously this requires a great deal of culturally specific knowledge that I personally lack with my own background. But luckily in the Flagstaff area, there was already an archaeological assemblage of ritual paraphernalia which had been previously interpreted by people who did have that knowledge. So my entry point into this problem was the so-called Burial of the Magician, a very famous 12th century burial that was excavated from Ridge Ruin, a short distance from here. And this burial contained hundreds of artifacts, including numerous ritual objects, and also many exotic trade goods, including parrots, a good deal of turquoise, a single conch shell. And finally, this individual was excavated from a center with some rather unique masonry that some people have said was emulating Chacoan styles. The unique thing about this burial, well, there are many unique things, but the one that was useful to me was that it has twice been interpreted by groups of Hopi cultural consultants. And they noted that many objects in this burial were the ritual paraphernalia used by one particular priesthood. And objects that were used by this priesthood included several prayer sticks, parts of an altar assemblage, and the ritual costume worn by a head priest. Also, this particular priesthood was historically present at other pueblos, including Zia, Zuni, Acoma, and Laguna, where their ritual paraphernalia was either described or photographed by early ethnographers. So this was really an unparalleled comparative set for identifying the ritual paraphernalia of a very particular type of ceremonial society in the archaeological record, including in the context that I was interested in, which is Chacoan centers. If I could identify this assemblage in Chacoan centers, then I could see whether it consistently co-occurred with the same exotic trade goods that appeared in the magician's burial. Most of these particular types of artifacts appear very, very rarely in archaeological contexts, both the ritual paraphernalia and these trade goods that I'm looking at. So I went straight to the hotspot, which is Pueblo Bonito. This Chacoan center has more excavated ritual paraphernalia and exotic trade goods than any other center in the American Southwest. I identified ritual paraphernalia at Pueblo Bonito as associated with this type of ceremonial society based on technological similarity to objects from the magician's barrel, but also to ethnographically documented priesthoods of this type. The results were extremely interesting. It worked better than I thought it would. I found 18 examples of ritual objects that were present in Pueblo Bonito, the magician's barrel, and the ethnographic documentation of this type of society. And bear in mind that these are only the objects that are technologically distinctive enough that I can identify them as ritual paraphernalia. There's numerous other objects that are natural objects that appeared in all three places. These objects include prayer sticks, effigy bows, bundled reed arrows, distinctive types of basketry, shell dippers, and a rather fabulous turquoise inlay bow guard that appears both in the magician's burial and at Pueblo Bonito. And the deposition of these objects was strongly patterned and also strongly related to the deposition of exotic trade goods. So each half of Pueblo Bonito is, or seems to be, associated with a genetically related burial group. And all of the ritual paraphernalia I identified as appearing in all three contexts, except for 3 objects concentrated in the burials in residential areas and probable ceremonial chambers of one group. And this burial group also seemed to have all of the provenience parrots described in published reports, 10 out of 12 of the provenience conch shells, and most of the objects that didn't appear in these areas seem to be in courtyard kivas, which may not be exclusively associated with either group. So the upshot is that my data does suggest that at least at Pueblo Bonito, a genetically related group, be it a clan, moiety, what have you, is controlling access to the materials needed to enact a particular type of ceremony, and this is associated with controlling access to particular exotic trade goods. And the same pattern actually held true for materials that didn't appear in the magician's burial, so I'm still hashing that out. So my argument is simultaneously very specific and very widespread, spatially and temporally, so I know it's going to be a tough sell, so I'm currently trying to replicate these results at Wupatki Pueblo. Preliminary findings are encouraging. There is a cluster of Chaco-style ritual paraphernalia, and very close to it there is a cluster of parrots and conch shells. I'm still working on proveniencing most of the things I'm interested in from that particular sector. If I could go back in time and throttle Jesse Walter Fuchs, I would do it. But, yeah, so I think I've identified a pattern. The question is, what does it mean? I've noticed that when I try to explain anything in Flagstaff in terms of anything in Chaco, Flagstaff archaeologists often give me this lemon face. Chaco archaeologists seem to be a little more all about explaining everything in terms of Chaco. But let me be clear on what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting that in the 12th century people in Flagstaff were part of the Chaco system. In fact, I'm associating this with the dissolution of the Chaco system. I think what this means is that a ritual that started out at Chaco in the 10th century had, so to speak, gone viral by the 12th century. And that by 1150, somebody, maybe just a few ceremonially empowered families, had crossed the Little Colorado and introduced a new assemblage and associated practice in the West. And I think this did have a significant impact on trade relations. I don't think that this particular ritual reached the Flagstaff area in exactly the same form it took when it left Chaco, and untangling what is imported and what's local variation is actually one of the more interesting parts of this problem. So, as I said, this research is still in progress. I've kind of spent the past few years hunting down the collections that I'd like to work with. One thing that I'd really like to do as I launch into my dissertation is get some tribal involvement, so that might determine very strongly which direction I go with this. But if anybody knows of collections in the Flagstaff area that I could actually do this sort of analysis with, please come talk to me. I'd love to chat. So, yeah, thank you.